Welcome everyone. Again, this is TDU's webinar, Getting Control of Production Standards. My name is Scott Jenkins. I'm an organizer for Teamsters for a Democratic Union. Thousands of Teamster warehouse workers work under engineered production standards. This workshop is going to arm you with the tools to get the information you need on standards in your workplace and strategies to protect yourself and your coworkers from standards-based discipline. So this is a small webinar. It is a participatory webinar. Everyone is encouraged to ask questions to our panel of experienced warehouse Teamsters, and there will be an opportunity for you to do that both through the chat box and live at the end of our call. So here's what you can expect to learn today. First, the basis of production standards and the different production standard systems. Second, your right to information from the employer on the methods at your shop. We'll also cover what makes a good case to grieve and how to use grievances and information requests to stop unfair discipline. Finally, we're going to cover how to prepare and conduct yourself if your workplace has a new time study. We'll also hear from our panelists about when it makes sense to organize for a new time study, and just as importantly, when it doesn't make sense to try to get a new time study. We're going to cover a lot of information, but after that, our panelists will take questions from you. After the webinar, we'll send you a toolkit of resources you can use to protect yourself, and you can share this information with your coworkers, get it out there to a wider group. This webinar is organized by Teamsters for a Democratic Union. For those who don't know, TDU is a grassroots network of Teamster members. We are independent of the IBT. We connect members from local unions across the country with the education and resources you need to organize for strong contracts and a strong local union. The Teamsters Warehouse Division is standing up to employers right now like never before. And we're here to support the fight for strong warehouse enforcement in every single local union. TDU is a membership organization. Classes like this one are funded by member dues. If you like what you learned today, join TDU. You can see on the screen we have a membership promotion. Membership for 1 year is $50 and you get a free TDU t-shirt, or you can join for a 3-year membership discounted to $100 and get a free sweatshirt. Again, it's your membership that makes it possible to hold classes like this and to reach more warehouse and grocery Teamsters. All right, let's keep going. So first, we're going to hear from Jeff Stewart about the basis of engineered production standards. Jeff is the principal officer of Local 206 in Oregon. Local 206 has thousands of warehouse workers, and Jeff has been dealing with production standards his entire career as a rank and file member, as a steward, as an agent, and now as a union officer. Jeff, take it away.
All right, thank you, Scott. So first, the definition of time standard. The time required for an average skilled worker working at a normal pace to perform specific tasks using prescribed method while accounting for allowances such as personal fatigue and delays. I will talk more about those later. Many workplaces wrongfully refer to production standards, but only engineered production standards built through scientifically accepted practices are legitimate, meaning that it actually has to have an engineer go through and put together the methods. Companies should not be able to just make this stuff up as they go. So key terms, these time standards are all developed. Most of them were to use a term called a TMU, which is a time measurement unit. A single TMU is 1/27th of a second. And the way they actually got to the 1/27th of a second is the speed of an 8mm camera. When they first started doing these time standards in the 1950s, each frame took 1/27th of a second. So they would record, and then they would count how many frames of an 8mm camera took to do that motion. An element, elements are what you're being measured on, distance, travel, your body motion. PF&D, personal fatigue and delay time. This is stuff using the restroom, getting tired towards the end of your shift. Delay time, as far as how many people are in the way, how long, if you're working So just delays you're going to face. Actual time is the time you're going to be measured on, and indirect time, which Frank will get into later, is time that is not in the standard and not part of the methods. So a stopwatch method is probably one of the most unreliable type methods. That's where you have a supervisor and engineer just follow you and watch you and actually click a stopwatch to see how long it's taking you. An engineered is actually going to be generally a videotape. They're going to watch all of your movements, all the different delayed times. They actually have college educated industrial engineers put together the time studies, and the predetermined motion time study is pretty much just taking information that other people have used and trying to apply it to the warehouse you're working in. So they're not engineering their own times, they're just using predetermined engineered times to figure out what your reasonable expectations should be, your time standards. All right, how are standards developed? Engineers that conduct time studies determine the reasonable expectation on time it takes to execute a task. And these are everything. You are being measured on every single aspect of your job. How long it's going to take you to step off and on your pallet jack, how long it's going to take you to grab your shrink wrap, apply labels if necessary. Every single thing you do is going to be under these time standards. And again, this is going to be measured to a 1/27th of a second.
Jeff, could you give us an example of the actual development of a standard in your local 206? Just walk us through the detail of what that's looked like with a specific shop.
Yeah, so we have the engineering department will come through. They will do an actual time standard check where they videotape. Then they go back and they analyze that videotape. And it's, again, all kinds of every single aspect of the job, how long it takes you to grab your pallet jack, labels, every single thing from start to finish on an assignment or work day. And then from time to time, they will do the stopwatch studies, which is more of a frequency test to make sure that the time standards are accurate. So they do a actual time standard, and then they'll do a frequency to make sure those are still correct using the stopwatch study. All right. So union stewards should seek to regulate, state, establish, and maintenance and production standards in every possible way through a variety of approaches, including contract language, member education. And I cannot stress enough about the importance of knowing and understanding how these time standards work. I think that member education, steward education is the absolute key in fighting these systems. Contract language is something that 206 rarely uses as far as the time standards go. We rely more heavily on the just cause standard if discipline is applied. So methods, definition, detailed sequence of steps necessary to perform a specific job function and or task. Again, I saw a lot of Kroger employees on this call, and their head engineer, whose name is Jeff Craig, will tell you if you speak to him, if it's not in the methods, it's not on standard. Methods should be developed with member input and involvement. Good methods are specific and have no room for interpretation. So again, if you're going to get measured on it, it has to be in the methods. It should not be left for interpretation. A lot of times we see companies adding safety rules and other type of logistics rules to your job function that often aren't given or put into the methods. When those happen, you are not being given time to do those functions. So some examples of good and bad methods language. For example, would be vague with no explanation. Use walk to pallet jack, ride pallet jack. Well, there's a lot more to it in your job. A good method defines exactly when to walk or to ride your pallet jack. If the next slot is less than 33 feet, 4 bays, 8 pick slots, walk to the jack. If the next slot is greater than 33, mount the jack and on the side and of the next pick and ride to the designated location. Never dismount in front of the jack when the jack is in motion. So this is a good method because it has exactly when you're supposed to walk or ride your pallet jack, because those are both two different methods. The time amountment for each of them is different. And this is also really good because it does put in the safety feature of dismounting in the front, not to dismount on the front of the jack, but to also always step off the side of the jack. So stretch wrapping pallet jacks, the poor method is leaves room for interpretation, and so it just stretch wrap the pallet jacks as necessary. Well, um, that leaves it up to way too much interpretation. How long, how many times are you going to be walking around the pallet? The good method is detailed and specific. For this many cubic feet, how many times are you going to be walking around? Because again, you are being measured on everything. How many times you're walking around the jack. So you do need full detailed methods, and the methods should include how many times you're going to walk around that pallet, depending on the cube of the pallet.
All right.
So, oh, this is Frank. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for walking us through some of the basics of production standards and the philosophy behind them. I want to emphasize one thing Jeff mentioned about unions and standards. There's a way in which the company talks about standards that can make them seem as if it's just something the engineer does, and it's off in another world. But the union can and should seek to regulate, how these methods are established. And like Jeff mentioned, there's a whole set of different ways to do that. But it's important to be involved, not just in how to protect yourself, but also how the standards get established to begin with. So the union has an active role to play here. So let's get into how members can actually get the information you need on the methods at your shop. If that's the background philosophy of how methods work, what do we actually do with that on the shop floor? So to talk about arming yourself with information on methods at your shop, we're going to hear from Frank Halstead. Frank is a shop steward at Ralph's in Southern California, local 572. He's also a co-chair of TDU's International Steering Committee. Frank, take it away.
Thank you, Scott. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're at in this country of ours. I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of their Sunday morning or afternoon to share with us and get some much needed information. As all of you know, if you ever speak to a warehouse order selector or picker, you know that there's never enough time, and we always want more time when we're picking orders. But unfortunately, bosses, judges, and other people, administrative law judges, are not impressed by workers' opinions. They just aren't. They don't really care what we think. So in order for us to defend ourselves and to hold the company accountable on these methods and on these standards, we have to have information. We have to have knowledge. We have to have documentation. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about right now, to give people a basic understanding of some of the things that they're entitled to, some of the things that they should ask for, because the more knowledgeable questions you ask, the more the company is going to respect you and the less they're going to try to take advantage of you. And it's really that simple. The more that you educate yourselves and inform yourself and get involved, the better you're going to be treated, the better your coworkers are going to be treated. And no one's going to do it but you. No one's going to come and save the day. There's no white knight. If it's not you, then it's not going to happen. So I applaud you for being on this call today. And I hope you get a lot out of this. And I hope to see you in future activities. So the one of the most important things that we emphasize is knowing your methods. As I stated earlier, we never have enough time for the job that we're required to do. But when you know your methods, you know exactly what you're giving time for and not giving time for. For example, picking up debris. There's a frequency in the method. And where I work, the frequency is you get time to pick up one piece of debris every other aisle. So if you know the method and you know that you're getting time to pick up one piece of debris every other aisle, well, then you're comfortable with that. And if a supervisor asks you to do more than that, you know that you're entitled to downtime because he's asking you to do something that's not in the system. The same thing with wrapping pallets, like Jeff talked about earlier. If you know you're getting 10 revolutions per pallet to wrap it, then you're good with that. If you can do it in 8 or 7, you may pick up a little bit of time. But if a supervisor is telling you to wrap it more than that, you know that you're not getting time for that, and you're entitled to ask for downtime. So the methods is the number one thing that I encourage people to get and to read and to go over with a fine tooth comb and make sure that everything you're doing is in those methods. Because once again, as Jeff stated earlier, if it's not in the methods, you are not getting time. It is that simple. So you really need to focus on the methods. So how do you get this information? That's another great question. And um, it's not always simple because, as we know, our employers fight back, and half of our supervisors don't know anything about the system, but they're going to pretend like they do, and they're going to tell you, you don't need that, or we don't have that, or what is that? You're entitled to all the information under federal labor law. So I mean, you can ask your supervisor. I suggest that you go up the chain of command and you try to find out the manager, the assistant manager who has some understanding of what it is, because it's going to be easier to talk to somebody who knows what you're asking for rather than somebody who doesn't. And I especially encourage you to try to build a relationship with your site engineer. Most employers have people that are in charge of production standards where they work. So try to seek that person out, find out who that person is, and try to get the information from them. And if not, most employers have somebody at a national level and their headquarters, they're in charge of engineers. The same thing applies to them. Most of these engineers like their systems, and they'll defend their systems, and they're proud of their systems. So they'll give you the information when you ask for it. You just have to know what to ask for, and they'll give it to you. So some of the stuff that we use to make sure that we monitor the system is the detail reports. When they try to discipline somebody, or they try to say that, they're doing good and we don't think that they're doing good, we get a detailed report on the individuals and make sure we go over that. And the detailed report is going to show you whether they got the time at the beginning of the shift to start up, whether they got all their breaks, all their lunches, all their downtime requests. And if it's going to show if there's any gaps in terms of maybe something happened that they forgot about. A pallet fell in front of them. They helped the forklift driver to help clean it up, and they forgot to ask for the downtime to get it. Anything of that nature that's going to show that there was something that they performed that they weren't given time for. And then there's also detailed reports, activity history, which is going to give you the specific commands as they are given to an individual, which is going to allow you to be a lot more detailed and go step by step in terms of what that order selector did for that period of time. So the detail reports and the activity history are two of the basic reports that you should be asking for when you think that there's going to be an issue regarding time, accurate time studies. Another thing to keep in mind is supervisors will play games all the time. These systems are based on randomness. Everybody's supposed to get a variety of the work. So you can't stick some person in one area and have them pick just that bill and then take care of other people while you're giving them shorts or outs or lighter items or easier items to select. They're not built that way. They're built in a way where everybody's supposed to get a variety of the work. So you have to keep an eye on that too and make sure. So that's another thing you can request is like, okay, I want to see how all the bills were distributed and who got what bills. Well, what bills this certain individual got and what bills another individual got, just to try to make sure that they're not playing games and assigning easier work that has more time to some people and not to other people. We can go to the next slide. So any kind of method changes, anything that they do, if they tell you, oh, you have to add a separation, you got to put a piece in between the pallet, well, then is there time for that? You have to make sure that there's time for that. If they change the area where you're going to get empty pallets at the beginning of your order, well, you got to make sure that they make time for that they gave you that extra travel time. Any safety requirements, like I said earlier, in terms of stopping at the end of the aisle and honking before you go forward, that has to be in there. Any quality requirements, there's a new law regarding organics where they have to be separated. So now you have to stack organics separate and you have to put them on top of the other product. You can't have other product on top of organics. So is that in the system where they give you the time to do that? New equipment or faulty equipment? You know, is your equipment old? Is it run down? What sort of calculation did they do to test the speed of the equipment? But this is kind of a double-edged sword. There's a example out there where the workers made a big stink about having bad equipment, so the company turned around and said, "Okay, we're going to buy all new pallet jacks, and now you're going to be expected to pull 100% all the time." So you know, you got to be careful sometimes what you ask for, because you might just get it and it might not be the best thing for you. Changes to racking is a big one. And that's where, you know, inventory and audit trails come in, because you'll have a double deep racks that give you a little bit more time because you got to step in. You got single racks, you got sideways racks, and you got to make sure that, because product is always changing, especially in produce, where they put it, and that the proper amount of time is given for you to go into that racking and pick that product, because it's not uncommon for those changes not to be made, and for you not to get the right time. And that brings up another point in terms of inventory. Cases, you're given time, fractions of seconds, like Jeff said, TMUs, to pick cases. And the time that you're given is based on the case weight and the case size. So if inventory is not doing their responsibilities and keeping track of the changing weights and sizes of cases, because product changes and they buy them from the employers buy stuff from different vendors all the time, and they come in different packaging. If they're not monitoring that and they're not making the adjustments, you could not be getting the appropriate time for the cases that you're picking. And that's a big issue in a lot of different warehouses. You can go to the next one. So non-standard or missing work, you know, that's things that they're asking you to do that they're not giving you time for. And you have to make sure that, once again, you know those methods, and that you know everything that you're given time for, and the things that you're not given time for, because you don't want to be performing work and not giving the proper amount of time to do that. And then to deterioration of standard conditions, you always got to keep an eye on things and make sure that they're doing, you know, not, once again, not having you go through racks and not having you do things that you're not getting time for. And inadequate PF&D allowances. This is something that's always going to be a problem depending where you work. And this is another thing where you can ask, most of the time, companies don't give you they give you PF&D allowances based on an accepted standards methodology, which is allowances based on either Kornman, Page, Williams, or ILO, which are allotments for different time, depending on the lighting, depending on how cold it is. There's a lot of different factors that determine what your PF&D allowances are. So it's important to make sure you know what your PF&D allowances are, and they should be different for different parts of the warehouse. If you're picking in produce, they're going to be one. If you're picking in frozen, they're going to be another, because the cold, you know, does different things to your body, and you have to get more fatigue in those situations. And then congestion is your delay time. And these and this is critical to understand, and this is critical to remember, these PF&D allowances only pertain to normal conditions. Normal conditions. I hate it when the supervisor says, "Oh, it's in there. It's in there. You know, something happened and you know, it's not normal, and you had to, you know, help do this or help do that, or whatever delays you encountered." And they'll say, "Oh, it's in there. You already." No, you didn't. You didn't get it in there. It's not in there. That's only for normal situations that you encounter on a daily basis. It's not for these situations that happen every once in a while. So make sure that you become familiar with that and you know that. And the most important thing about production standards is companies try to mystify them like they're this, you know, all powerful thing that common everyday workers, you know, are not capable of understanding or knowing. Well, that's not wrong. That's not accurate. That's completely wrong. Common everyday workers, we know how to do the work, and we know when the standards are off. I can tell you numerous times where guys have come up to me and say, "I don't know what it is, but there's something wrong in this area." And the more we dig and the more we research, we find out that that person was right. One time the travel path was wrong. They weren't giving time because you have one-way travel down an aisle. If you got an out and it was at the beginning of the aisle, they were just giving you time to go from that location to the door. Well, you can't. You have to go down the rest of the aisle, and then you have to come back the other aisle, or else you're in violation of safety rules and not following the proper path of direction. Well, the employer made a miscalculation and didn't put that incorrect. So that person was right. He couldn't explain it, but he knew something was off, and it was. And after enough of a investigation, we found out, and they rectified it. So we know. But the most important thing to realize and understand is this is not absolute science. We never, ever, ever acknowledge that a standard is accurate. Never. It's either acceptable or not acceptable. Okay? It's either acceptable or not acceptable. It is never accurate. Even the staunchest defenders of these systems will admit that it's not hard science. They're based on judgments and approximations, and there's a 5% margin of error, sometimes even higher than that. So don't let them lead you to believe that these things are some unquestionable, scientific, unarguable thing. They're not. They're very arguable. Very, very arguable. And as warehouse people, we need to know that, and we need to not be scared to argue it. Next slide. So how do we fight these? It's not in our best interest to file grievances against the system because that puts the burden of proof on us. We want to fight discipline. We want to grieve discipline, because when you grieve discipline, you put the burden of proof on the employer to prove that the system they use is justified and meets the just cause standard that Jeff talked about earlier. So it's our advice that we don't try to tear apart the system and learn the system to the degree that we have to prove that it's faulty. It's much easier for us and much more effective for us if we just grieve the discipline that results from unfair systems. And using information requests is super valuable and super effective at picking apart the unfairness of these systems and when things are not done correctly. And once again, you have the right to get all this information under federal labor law, which is not always simple, and you're going to need the support of your business agent and of your local. And as we all know, there's a lot of locals and business agents out there that don't do their job and that don't support their members. So you're going to have to be creative and figure out ways how to pressure them and how to try to get them to do the right thing. But the more you know, the more you can teach them. And the more you know, the more you can ask from them. And at some point in time, they're going to say, okay, fine, we'll do it, because you're going to know what you're talking about, and you're going to have good ideas, and you're going to be requesting good information, and it's going to be valuable to the success of the case. And eventually, if you're consistent and persistent, you will prevail. But it's a fight. It's a culture change. If you think you're going to look at this webinar and go back to work tomorrow and just say, hey, I want this information and your system's wrong, and believe me, I saw a webinar and it's true. It doesn't work like that. You got to organize. You got to get your coworkers involved. You got to educate yourself. You got to inform yourself, and you got to pick your battles wisely so you can notch some victories and so you can make some improvements that will show people it can be done, and then more people will get involved. And the bottom line is the more people you have with you, the stronger you are and the more effective you're going to be able to be. It's that simple. So the other thing is, a lot of time people will just jump to, well, we want a time study. We want a time study. And it's not always the smartest course of action to do that. Because if you have a workforce that is not familiar with how studies work, they can make a bad situation worse. So you really have to weigh, is this system so bad that we can't live with it? And if so, do we have enough people involved that are willing to get educated and prepare themselves to have a good, beneficial time study done on our behalf? Or are we just inviting the company to come in and make a bad situation worse? Because it's not so much the speed and the pace at which people work. they get time, predetermined amounts of time for the elements they perform. And that's one thing that workers need to know when they're being timed. No one's telling you to slow down. No one's telling you to pick up 20 pieces of debris every aisle, you know, because that's just going to throw the study out. The engineer's going to be like, this person's playing games. No, we're not going to use that one. But what we are asking you to do, and what we are encouraging you to do, is to know the methods, know the safety requirements, and follow them as fast as detailed as possible to make sure you perform all the elements, because that's what's going to give you the time. Is the elements is going to give you the time, and then following all the safety rules is going to give you time. And at the end of the study, no matter how fast the person is, you're going to get the time for all those elements, and the study is going to be more beneficial than otherwise. It really boils down to how informed and educated your workforce is to make sure that these time studies are beneficial and don't backfire on you. The next slide. Union information requests. So we kind of covered this, but we have, I mean, there's so much stuff that you need to ask for. And we're going to have a toolkit after this seminar that's going to give you a list of the things. But some of the basics are very simple. Request the procedure by which the company established a standard, who has access to the system, when and how changes are made, how are they documented, request a procedure by which the company establishes PF&D allowance like they talked about before, Kornman, ILO, Williams, which one did they use? Ask management to produce published studies of documentation used to determine the fatigue allowance. Often you can challenge these assessments. You know, once again, it's judgments and approximations. It's not hard science. So it's very arguable, and it's very doable on our part if we ask the right questions to get the right information to fight these standards and make them more livable for us to work under. The next slide. Okay, when you're picking a good, you know, test case to grieve, make sure you pick somebody who's consistent. Make sure you pick, so the first thing the company's going to look at is, look at how long he's taking on his breaks and lunches. That's why he's not making a standard. He's taking extra long breaks and lunches, or he's starting late, or he's finishing early, or he's taking, you know, all these gap time situations during the course of his shift. You know, saying he's in the restroom, but how many times can somebody use the restroom? So make sure you pick a good test case where somebody's consistent, they're starting on time, they're taking their proper time breaks, proper lunches, and then use those test cases as the one you move forward with, not the ones that are going to end up backfiring, biting you in the behind. Okay, next slide. Resources. I'm going to hand this back over to Scott. He's going to talk a little bit about resources that are going to be made available after this webinar.
Thank you, Frank. Like Frank said, there's a lot of detail in dealing with production standards, in fighting discipline on them. We have a web page that has a list of handbooks and other resources that will go into great detail about what you need to know to effectively fight standards-based discipline. So we'll come back to that at the end, but for now, I want to thank Frank for the information he gave us. And I want to get into some examples of how this works on the shop floor. So to help us out, we're going to bring up a panel of some Teamster stewards and members to join Frank and Jeff. And we're going to ask some questions about how this actually works and open things up to you to ask questions as well. So we're going to be joined by Vince Wilkes. Vince is the chief steward at Kroger in Indiana Local 135. He has more than 23 years of experience as a warehouse Teamster. We're also going to be joined by Tyler Jones. Tyler Jones is a rank and file warehouseman at Ralph's in Southern California, Local 572. And then we will also bring Frank and Jeff back on the screen for you. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. I'm going to ask some questions to our panelists so we can get some real world examples. But people on the call, if you have questions for our panelists, put them in the chat box. I saw a few come up while Jeff and Frank were giving their presentations. Write your questions in the chat box. And if we have time at the end of the call, we'll also be able to take questions live as well. So the first question I want to pitch to our panelists is one we touched on a little bit, but didn't get too deep into, which is how do you decide when your shop needs a new time study? What are some of the trade-offs that you think about one way or the other? Who'd like to give this a stab? Maybe Jeff?
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things is that what I've noticed a lot of the time, it's when they start adding a lot of safety aspects to the job. Managers, supervisors are telling you to do this. You educated yourself and are well aware of the methods, and you know that that time isn't being on standard. So at that point, you need to make sure that if it's a safety requirement or another job aspect requirement that's not in the methods, that's when you really need to step up and make sure that the engineers are aware of these other job requirements.
I do a audit trails out at work, and you're entitled to these audit trails. I ask for them once a week for the selectors, for the lift truck operators and the loaders. And I kind of follow those. And if I see that there's something going out of norm, then I'm going to have questions and find out why, what has changed and why it's changed. That's how I kind of keep up with it. But there's also a lot of other factors too, right? We used to have a very, very high turnover rate. And I've been pretty fortunate to talk to Denny Tolan, which is our chief engineer for Teamsters International. And anybody under 2 years really doesn't know their job completely. So that's going to create a lot of downtime or delay time. I'm sorry, a lot of delay, more so if you've got a bunch, like I had 60 guys that were brand new. So, I mean, there's different things you got to look at, but I think just following the audit trail and knowing what's going on in your shop will bring all this together to help you to determine if you need to get a time study or is somebody just goofing off kind of.
Perfect. Thank you, Vince. Earlier, Jeff, you walked us through some examples of well-written standards that were specific and detailed, that left no room for interpretation, and some poor standards that were open to all sorts of questions. If you have a bad standard or a bad method, how do you fix a poorly written method to make it more specific and accurate? What can members do to get that process moving?
I think the biggest thing somebody could do is to, hopefully with the support of their local union, is to file a grievance on it, especially if those methods are leading to any type of discipline. Even if there's not contractual language involved in it, you always have the just cause argument, the just cause standard. And if you are working under poor methods and it's causing potential discipline, you file a just cause standard grievance on it.
Frank, anything to add to this? How do you address poorly written methods?
Well, I think you know, like what Jeff said, you file a grievance on the poorly written methods. But I think another thing that people should consider is that we're not going to get 15%, 20%. You're not going to get big chunks of time like that at one whop. The way we're going to beat these unreasonable production standards is a minute here, 30 seconds here, a minute and a half here. You start detailing and picking those systems apart. And when you're done with the process, then it adds up to a significant amount of time. And you get the 5% or the 10% increase that you were looking for. So don't look for some huge amount of missing time somewhere. Be happy getting a little bit of time here, a little bit of time there, a little bit of time here. And poorly written methods is exactly the way to do that. If you see a method that's poorly written, you bring it to the company's attention and say, hey, this method's not accurate. Most of these engineers are going to be, upfront about something that's not accurate. They're not going to sit there and lie and tell you, oh no, that's great. It's like supervisors will, but most of these engineers won't. most of these engineers are going to be like, yeah, you're right. That's like, I've been to school and that's not something they taught us, you know? So, you know, and that's how you succeed. You pick it apart, one little thing at a time, one area at a time. And then that's how you'll boost the total percentage to be somewhere that you can live with.
So again, it's a complicated issue that can cut both ways, as you have to assess the situation to figure out how to approach it. I just want to remind members on the call, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat box or raise your hand. Shortly, we'll get to taking some live questions from participants on the call. Tyler, Tyler's the menace of Ralph's supervisors in Local 572 over the issue of downtime. My question for you is, how do you make sure you get the downtime that you are owed? And how do you make sure that the company actually accounts for that downtime that you're owed?
So I'd say I start with consistency. Tracking your downtime. I keep like a little notepad on me on my jack. Write down if there's a spill or whatever it is. I write down the time it happened, the duration of long, and then I keep going about my business. When there's a break or a lunch right before that time, I head in the office. I ask for my downtime. After that, towards the end of the shift, try and follow up. Hey, did I get my downtime? Check my time. If it's there, cool. If not, follow up maybe the next day. Hey, I didn't get my downtime. Can I get it inputted? And then after that, like if there's any pushback, I might grab somebody like Frank and say, hey man, I've been asking for downtime, haven't been getting it. I have my detailed lists. And then I try to ask again with him. And usually it's solved by then. Like I said, like with consistency, if you're shown that somebody that constantly does it right, there's not much blowback. They're just, he's in here again. He's asking for it again. It must be pretty, pretty standard. But now if you're somebody that doesn't ever ask them, they're going to take advantage of it. They're not going to give it to you. If you don't follow up, they're not putting it in. So just consistency, just come in there and kind of like you said, pest them like, hey, I need my downtime. Kind of just basically that.
So consistency, documentation, follow up. Other panelists, anything you want to add about downtime and addressing issues with downtime with management?
One thing I did about 17 years on the warehouse floor, and the big comeback from management was always it's built in. And that's when the education on the methods is really, really important, because if it's not in the methods and you're doing it, if it's a spill, whatever it is, and you're being told it's built in, and you're not seeing it in the methods, it's not built in, and you need to request your downtime for it. And as Frank said earlier, we're not looking for 15-20% changes, but these production standards and the discipline level on these production standards is so tight that if you are stopping to help clean up a spill for 4 or 5 minutes a day, that's going to affect your overall production, and you're going to be looking at discipline. So never take the answer that it's built in for what it's worth, because if it's not in the methods, it's not built in, and you should be getting that delay time for it.
Great. I want to switch gears a little bit to a question that we have in the chat box from Rick. When there's an issue with a standard at your workplace and you have an engineer scheduled to come a few months out, this case it's 4 months, but members currently are getting discharged for production, what do you do? I'm taking this as a question about like basically how do you prepare your members if you have a scheduled visit from an engineer, you're having issues with discipline right now. What do you do in that situation? How do you get ready? And what do you tell the members to do?
This, as a steward, this is Vince Wilkes. As a steward, if I've got members and I think the system is wrong or pretty sure it's wrong, a member is getting terminated, it would be on the grievance. I'd also like it, I'd put pending the outcome of the audit or of the union coming in and doing a trail on it. And whatever that is, if maybe we can get the member back, but it'd be pending the outcome of whatever Denny Tolan or his group determines that how far that system is off.
I just think it's imperative that we ask questions. I mean, we're most powerful when we're asking questions about everything that we can, and every answer that they provide to one of the questions should spark even more questions. And if they have information, they know that something is the way it is, well, then show us. If you're so sure that this is correct, well, then show us the documentation, show us the proof. So, and you know, I think when it comes to discipline, getting all the reports, you know, like I said, the detailed reports, the activity histories, going through them with the fine tooth comb, making sure that that person that's being disciplined got all his breaks, lunches, all his startup pre-shift time, everything that he was entitled to, all of the downtime request sheets, all the downtime that he requested. You really have to go through it with a fine tooth comb. And it's an opportunity to organize. I mean, look at what better way to inspire workers to get involved and say, hey, you don't want to be like this guy who just got fired for unreasonable production standards. We have a engineer coming in 2 months. We want to be in the best position possible. And the way we do that is by learning about the system, knowing the methods, knowing all the procedures and the rules and the safety requirements, and making sure that when that audit, when that engineer comes down to do a time study, that we're all doing exactly what we need to do to get the best result possible. So it's organize, organize, organize.
Jeff, do you have anything to add on preparing when a time study is scheduled, how you try to get the members ready?
Again, Frank nailed it. It's just really making sure you're well aware of all the safety rules, any other rules, making yourself educated on the methods, and touching on what Frank, part of his presentation earlier, is what you don't want to do is organize everybody to work really slow in that time. You know, people are like, oh, the engineers are in, everybody, you know, slow down a little bit. Well, these guys are well trained on observing workers. If everybody's working slow, they're going to throw out the methods, and they're going to throw out all the time standard studies, and you're not going to be any better off. So what you want to do is work to the rule. You follow all the rules, you work at the pace that you can, but you want to use every single rule that you've been given and weaponize them. You know, follow every single safety rule, follow every single rule, follow every single method. Everything that you're being told to do, you do it, and you do it at a pace that you can work. But you definitely don't want to organize any type of slowdown, because that's not going to help anything at all. It's going to throw everything out and just slow the process down, especially if people are being terminated for it.
Good. Thank you, Jeff. Just a quick time check. We're about 5 minutes out from the hour. I can see some good questions coming in the chat box. I think we'll go for another 5 minutes with questions to address these. Before we head there, I do want to bring up an issue for the panelists around gap time. So how do you suggest that members keep track of gap time? And what do you do if the company is claiming that, you know, members are trying to steal time when they're using their gap time? How do you make sure that you address issues around that?
Documentation. If you're not working, there's a reason, and you need to document it. And that way, if they come at you and they say, hey, we have 20 minutes of no activity, what were you doing? You could say, well, I was in the restroom, or I was having this issue or this problem or whatever was taking place. Just like they use documentation against us, we need to use documentation against them. Gap time is difficult. People also need to know, like, once again, if you know the methods, you know it's trigger to trigger. Your next order doesn't start until you know, accept it, until you either scan it or you say ready on the headset. And then the new one starts and the old one's done. If you know it's trigger to trigger, then you have a better opportunity to determine when you're going to do whatever you need to do in terms of using the restroom and doing things. And you're not going to run into situations where you have as much gap time on one bill opposed to another. But gap time is definitely something that employers look at, and it's difficult to defend because it's right there on paper. You had no activity from this point to this point. If you can't explain that, then they're not going to look too favorably upon you.
And in practical terms for documentation, Tyler mentioned carrying a small notebook. Is that what you recommend? Any other recommendations on the practices around documentation?
Vince Wilkes, we have carbon copies that we fill out our downtime on. So, you know, you've got one, the company gets two, then they give you one back telling you what downtime you have. But on top of that, I ask them if you've got a gap, like they don't really give you downtime if you dump your pallet. A selector makes a sharp turn. They don't really give you downtime for that, but it does create a gap. So what I ask the selectors to do, just write gap. Don't ask for downtime. Just write gap by it so that gap is being monitored. They'll be able to look back at their sheets and say, well, company, this is why I've got this gap. I already showed you. That's kind of how we do it, but every place is different, I'm sure, but you do need to make sure you're documenting why it happened.
We're at the hour, so I'd like to wrap us up. I just want to take one more question here from Raymond Gonzalez, local 63. Raymond here from Ralph's in Riverside. They're always moving product to completely different aisles, no new racks, just moving product. A product in a location that weighed 2 to 3 pounds is replaced by a product weighing 30 plus pounds. Is that automatically corrected? Is Raymond's question. Any of our panelists?
Yeah, I can. So when product comes in, the product is actually given dimensions. I believe Kroger uses 28 different case sizes. They can be small, dense, large, light. So the case itself, the product itself is actually given that time. Where it's located in the warehouse shouldn't have that much effect on it. I can tell you one thing that Local 206 fought for that I'm pretty proud of is that we have union slotting foremen, and only union members are the ones that move cases from slot to slot. People who've done the job. So we were successful in a grievance and were able to we had supervisors that never touched a case in their life trying to move stuff around, and we filed a grievance and were able to get this slotting form position to where people who actually know how the cases should stack up are now heavily involved in it.
Thank you, Jeff. So it's time to wrap this up. Obviously, there's a lot more questions. There's a lot of detail to go into. And that's why it's important that the conversation does not end here, but you continue to stay in touch with TDU so we can get these questions answered and connect you with the resources you need to solve these problems at your shop and in your local. So you'll see on the screen a link to a resources toolkit page around production standards that is on our website. We want you to take what you learned here and take it back to your coworkers. Also, this was just a taste. To get into production standards at a level of depth, you're going to need more than one hour webinar to do. So this is just a taste. The web page has links to great guides from the International Union. You can see some of them on the screen. And the Wisconsin School for Workers, which teaches an excellent online class on production standards to really get into the weeds. The next online class at the Wisconsin School for Workers is in October. The link is on the website. We recommend you check that out. Frank, is there anything or any of our panelists you want to add about the resources?
Yeah, there's a lot of good information out there. And we all know that every warehouse order selector or forklift operator isn't going to want to read these manuals, isn't going to want to read these books, and isn't going to want to take an online course at the Wisconsin School for Workers. But some of you are. And I encourage those of you who have a high level of interest and motivation to do so. But we also have like one-page articles from Labor Notes and from the Teamster Voice, which is a publication put out by TDU, that can give even the person who just wants to know a little bit, some vitally good information on how to protect themselves and how to, hold the company accountable when it comes to these systems. So we have a variety of information, no matter what level you're at or where you want to be, to appeal to you, to give you some sort of ammunition to fight back with. There's leaders and there's title holders. And I got to give Jeff Stewart credit for that because he's the one who told me that first. And title holders, they may hold the titles, but they're not doing the work. Leaders are you guys, people who take their time out of their day to get information and are doing the work. And in order to be a leader, you have to have information and education. And that's where TDU comes in. TDU comes in by providing information and education and networking with other Teamster warehouse people all across the country that share identical and similar issues as you, so we can brainstorm and we can get in ideas and suggestions on how to attack issues in our workplaces. So I can't encourage you guys highly enough to join TDU and become part of the leaders that are going to be fighting to make workplaces better, to get better contracts, to hold companies accountable, and to just make our working lives a little bit easier. So I can't, like I said, I've been a TDU member a very long time, and my biggest regret in the Teamsters Union is I didn't join as soon as I became a Teamster. I learned more in my first 6 months as a TDU member than I did in my first 9 years as a Teamster. So I can't encourage you any more than that to join TDU. And that's all I got, Scott.
Thank you, Frank. And I'll just emphasize again, it's membership dues that make classes like this possible. So please consider joining. All right. So there's going to be a video recording of this webinar available soon that you'll be able to share tips with other members. After the webinar ends and we close out, you're going to get a text message and an email with a feedback form that's asking you what you thought about this. Take a second, just takes a minute to fill it out. Let us know what you think about this class. And just as importantly, what other classes you want to see covered for warehouse Teamsters. So thank you again to our speakers and panelists, to Jeff, Frank, Tyler, Vince. Thank you for coming on here. And thank you all who are on here as participants for taking the time out of your Sunday to make our union a little bit stronger. So please fill out the feedback form, stay in touch, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.